right, here we go, guys. Here we go. We are getting started, and this is going to be about LGBTQ. So, some of you know that I did another a recent live stream on LGBTQ and gender identity. I didn't hit record. I don't know why I didn't hit record. But today we're going to be talking about LGBTQ and gender identity. And you might be asking why. And the reason why is because, I find in the past 20 years, there's been a marked shift when it comes to the full acceptance of the LGBTQ community. I remember graduating from a Catholic high school in 2003, and one of my friends, Josh, he is openly gay, and he could not bring his partner to prom. That was in 2003. Principal sent out a message to everyone saying that Josh can't bring his partner. And I understand it's the Catholic religion and all that, but 2003, that wasn't that long ago, 20 years ago, there was this reticence to openly acknowledging and accepting the LGBTQ community in Toronto, which is, I think, one of the most socially progressive cities in the world. And so I thought to myself, how is it that this group, the LGBTQ group, has basically transformed in terms of its social acceptance across so many spheres of our lives? Here in Toronto during Pride Month, our major 5 banks changed their logos to reflect the Pride flag. We, here in the city of Toronto and many cities around the world, fly the Pride flag across municipal buildings, government buildings, schools, etc., indicating that this is a safe space for people from the LGBTQ community. People of different gender identities and sexual orientations are now a protected class under various countries' human rights codes, etc. And so there has been a massive, in my opinion, societal shift from 2003 when my friend Josh could not bring his partner to prom. And so I want to explore this more, what has kind of led to this massive societal shift, but also talking to, groups who work with the LGBTQ2+ community about some of the challenges that the community still has. And it got me thinking, it's like, this is really a fascinating area because there still is a lot of concern by people about the full adoption of LGBTQ in our schools, in classrooms, in society writ large. So in this live stream, in this episode, I'm kind of going to go down the path of why I think this is an important topic to discuss, why I've spent time on my podcast discussing this with groups and individuals who are both proponents as well as those who are concerned, to get to some type of understanding on the way forward. So I want to briefly talk about the fact that LGBT identification in the United States, for example, is up 7%. I believe that's up year over year, but it says that here the percentage of U.S. adults who self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or something other than heterosexual has increased to a new high of 7.1%, which is double the percentage from 2012 when Gallup first measured it. Now, a question that I have with this statistic is whether or not this is people who are now openly self-identifying, but not anyone who's net new LGBTQ, if that makes sense. So because of more social acceptance, is it that people who were already LGBTQ prior to 2012 are now more comfortable coming out saying that they self-identify as LGBTQ? Because now it's way more accepted than it was 10, 15 years ago, in my case, 20 years ago here in Toronto. And we can see in 2012, 3.5% identified as LGBTQ, and now it's 7.1%. And here's another interesting, if I can zoom in. So Americans' self-identification by generation, we see that Gen Zs are 75% heterosexual, boomers are 90%. So this is interesting, eh? Traditionalists born before 1946, 92% identify as heterosexual, compared to Gen Zs born between 1997 and 2003, only 75%. Now, take this for what it's worth. Remember, social acceptance wasn't there in 1946. So it very well could be that there were, 10, 15, 20% of the population that did not identify as straight and heterosexual. So that's interesting. It says here, LGBT identification has been stable in older generations and rising in younger, as we just discussed. But again, take this with a grain of salt, because remember, social acceptance is a big thing. And I don't know how many people would have accepted people back in the 1940s and 50s. Bisexual identification, most common amongst LGBT Americans. More than half of LGBT Americans indicate that they are bisexual. That's interesting. That percentage translates to 4% of all U.S. adults. Meanwhile, 21% of LGBT Americans say they are gay, 14% lesbian, 10% trans, and 4% something else. Really interesting. So amongst LGBT U.S. adults, the majority are bisexual by far, followed by gay, lesbian, trans, and then other. Really interesting. 1 in 6 Generation Z adults identify as bisexual. Wow. Nearly 1 in 6 Gen Z adults identify as bisexual. So again, because around this time there's becoming more and more awareness and acceptance, this number may in fact go up as the years progress and more acceptance continues. Again, we can see bisexual by generation is very low in traditionalists, but then again, you look across the board for traditionalists, everything's low. And to me, that's just a reflection of general acceptance, social acceptance. Really interesting. So this is one reason why I've decided to really focus on it in my podcast, is talking to people who are part of the community and what discrimination and other things that they still face. So one group that I interviewed was the 519, and this is an organization here in Toronto that works with the LGBTQ community. And I'll tell you, one thing that I found working with the 519 is that they have told me openly about some of the real discrimination that the LGBTQ community faces on a daily basis when it comes to everything from housing, finances, employment. And I'm going to get into that in 1 second. I'm just going to check the chat to see if anything is happening right now. I don't think there is. Remember, tell your friends, tell everyone to come join the Open Minds podcast on Twitch. It's pretty cool. Things are happening. So when I talked to the 519 about some of the what's happening in the community, what are some things that the community is still going through? Discrimination is a real thing, and a lot of communities face it in higher percentages than others based on what people report. Remember, discrimination is one of those things. It's like many people experience it, but very few people actually go out and report police hate crimes, talk about it openly. There's still stigma. So we can only judge discrimination based on what we see in statistics and reports that we get back. And some of the areas that discrimination happens for LGBTQ members, especially members of the community that are openly or physically, that have physical, if you can say, physical attributes that you can identify them as, discuss a lot of open discrimination towards them. So trans individuals, for example, talk about discrimination, finding places to rent, finding housing, discrimination in trying to get a loan or mortgage, and discrimination in the office and workplace settings, and just in general in the public. So there's a lot of discrimination that LGBTQ members face. And just to highlight this, I found this stat the other day. But basically, housing is one of the number one concerns that the LGBTQ community faces. And we'll get into the youth in a second. But basically, the point here being that housing was the number one issue that LGBTQ community members faced when it came to finding proper housing. Now, you might be thinking, what kind of discrimination does a member of the LGBTQ community face when it comes to housing? You'd be surprised. Like when I interviewed the 519, there'd be people telling me that, finding housing was so difficult because landlords would discriminate based on, who your partner is, not knowing your partner, the type of, culture or community you're going to bring into your home, apartment, dwelling, etc. If you're trans, talking about your pronouns. They may not fit in the he, she, but I believe on, rent applications, pronouns are part of that. So there's discrimination there. Sometimes landlords screen out people who are LGBTQ, who may have different pronouns than he, she. These are some of the ways people experience housing discrimination. And then on top of that, so if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, coming out to your parents may be a big anxiety-inducing stressor. And a lot of youth don't want to engage in, obviously, that constant, battle with their parents. So they run away from home, or maybe some cases they get kicked out of their home. So they need to find housing immediately. And this is why a lot of the stats are around, LGBTQ youth who experience discrimination in the workplace, but also, I just had the stat here. Where was it? I can't find my statistics today. It was just basically that LGBTQ youth face a lot of discrimination when it comes to housing, and trying to find housing. So imagine you're a young person, 17, 18 years old, and you are trying to find housing, and you don't have, let's say, employment or enough employment. It's hard for you to find first and last. Your parents have kicked you out of the house, as an example. It's just a lot of issues. I wish I could find it. Here it goes. Percent of needs cited by LGBTQ youth by number of total responses. So we can see that housing is at 26%. Let's see if I can expand this. Sorry, guys. I wanted to have this. So if we go in more, we can see that the percent of needs cited by LGBTQ youth by total responses is 26% for housing. This is 2015. And then percent of needs cited by transgender youth by total number of responses housing is at 28%. So slightly more, followed in both cases by employment. And then for trans youth, its transitional supports is like really high as well. So what we see here is that housing is the number one concern. And again, this is something that's hard for heterosexual people, aka myself, who still struggles with understanding the discrimination that a lot of members in the community face when it comes to housing or other areas. And, it's one of the things we take for granted. Finding a place to rent, finding a place to purchase, getting a home application like a loan or a mortgage. We don't, as heterosexual people, we don't think about being discriminated against based on being male or female. But if you don't fall into those gender identities, sexual orientations, there's a lot of discrimination that members of the community face. Again, as a heterosexual man, I was completely unaware to this and the housing issues that people who work at the 519 here in Toronto were telling me more and more about some of the experiences that members face. And so in addition to that, you think about finding a mortgage application, finding a rental application. This is why I think banks, especially around Pride Month, are changing their logos to the pride flag, the trans flag here in Toronto, and openly saying that this is an accepting and welcoming space, because they know very well that banks have not been historically accepting of people of the LGBTQ community. And that is also fascinating. So you take away housing, you take away the ability to access financial tools, and those are such important aspects and elements of a person's life. And they are being discriminated against openly. Again, I'm thinking especially for those whose pronouns are not he, she, who openly don't or have some physical definitions, if you want to say, or physical attributes that they are trans. They face all types of physical aggression in their day-to-day lives. Again, really interesting and sad to know even in Toronto, a very progressive society, there's still a lot of discrimination that people face. And I would say also in the 519 that they also were talking about some of the programs that they run for members of the LGBTQ community, specifically on housing. Because Canada is one of the only countries, I believe, in the world where we accept refugees from countries where they're being persecuted based on sexual orientation. So I think there's like 70 countries in the world where gender identity and sexual orientation are bases for, I don't know if it's 70 countries where it's criminal, but it's basically you are being persecuted in 70 countries around the world if you are a member of the LGBTQ community. And so Canada accepts refugees from across the world based on your sexual orientation, gender identity. Now, it's a lengthy process. You do need to fill out explicitly what the discrimination is, how your life is in fact in danger for being yourself. It's a big process. And to be honest, like I often think if you are trans, let's say, and you live in a country that is not accepting at all of the trans community, it's hard to always like write that down and relive that over and over again in your application to countries like Canada. As much as we'd like to say, I don't care about sexual orientation and gender identity, when you're applying for refugee status in a country, telling out your story, let's say, I think it's at like a few pages long, 5-10 pages long, that's a lot of reliving. And I wonder if there's a better way of doing that. I don't know, but the government does need to know, obviously, in detail. But I just often wonder, like, is there a better way to do that? Anyways, so housing is one. Financial services is another area, big area for members in the community to feel that support. Remember, think about it like this: not being able to get mortgage applications, not being able to get loans, lots of discrimination towards the LGBTQ community. A lot of these applications require pronouns. They require, let's say you change your name and your birth certificate says Christopher, but you change your name to another name. That can be a big barrier. Your social insurance number has your birth certificate name, but if you change your name, how does that change there? Like, there's all types of things where based on your gender identity, sexual orientation, you can be discriminated against when it comes to financial services. I'm going to pause there and see what's going on in the chat. Nothing's going on in the chat. That's okay, but I'm going to check. I also posted this on Insta, see if anyone's messaged me. I don't think they have, but hey, it's all good. Let's just take a looky. I need a glass of water. Man, this is a lot. But I am loving it. Okay, no messages on Insta, which is great. Take a sip of water here. Here we go. Leave something in the chat. Let me know how you're liking this. We're going to get into some really interesting statistics in a second. Okay, so tons of discrimination that the community faces. Talked about that. There's an uptick in people in the United States identifying as LGBTQ. Really interesting. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about is gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is really interesting. If I can get my gender dysphoria. Did I have that out? Probably not. Gender dysphoria diagnosis. Okay, so interestingly enough, gender dysphoria diagnoses have been going up quite dramatically. And what's really interesting here, where is the gender dysphoria rates? That's another thing. I really need to get used to the lexicon here. So diagnosis of gender dysphoria sometimes is met with some feeling like it's some illness that you need to fix, and it's not met with the sense of it's just a gender dysphoria referral or a gender dysphoria that's part of who you are. So definitely there has been that experience by some. Like if you diagnose someone with if you say the word diagnose, it's almost like you're diagnosing someone with a disease or something like that. So there's a lexicon there that people want to move away from. Okay, so if I zoom in, and this thing sometimes works, sometimes no. Let me just click on this, and then I will zoom in. Okay, so here we go. Child and adolescent referrals for gender dysphoria in the UK from 2010 to 2021-22. So we see it's generally gone up, specifically amongst females aged 12 to 17. So 12 to 17 females have really gone up in gender dysphoria rates from less than a few hundred in 2010 to over 2,500 by 2021, 22. It doesn't seem like a lot, but when you have a graph like this, it shows it a little bit more. Very different than male youth 12 to 17 that also started at a few hundred in 2010 and is just under 1,000 by 2021. And then it's really low for females and for males under the age of 12. So we see that adolescent females have a higher percentage of gender dysphoria referrals, which is interesting. I've done podcasts with Ken Zucker here in Toronto, who's a gender dysphoria expert, and used to head up the Center for Addiction of Mental Health's gender dysphoria section. So this is another complexity to the discussion on LGBTQ. It's that rates of gender dysphoria have been going up quite a bit. And I believe that there is more and more discussion. Let's just see, hang on. Yeah, so we see across the board, right? Like frequency of articles on gender dysphoria. That's interesting. Gender dysphoria articles are going up. But we're just seeing the average number of children referred to gender identity development service each week. And this is in Tavistock, so it's in England. So again, small amount. I mean, it's not, I don't know what the world amounts are, but another thing I found, and this is quite controversial in some circles, but there are researchers who are showing linkages between autism and gender dysphoria. Survey data from Autism Parenting Magazine reveals almost 6% of children with ASD have some form of gender dysphoria. So again, a question I would love to explore further. Let's just zoom in on this. Okay, so autism and gender identity. When did your child first show signs of gender identity struggles? 10 and older, 50%. Interesting. 33% under 5. Wow, 33% under 5. I need to know more about this study. What is your child's preferred pronoun? He, she is 60%. They 18. Birth assigned 17. And then other is less than 6. Puberty blockers. Again, it's very, very interesting. Some experts believe people are on the spectrum are naturally more nuanced, while others say it's a result of gender fluidity gaining increasing coverage in the media. Okay, so this is one of the interesting findings talking to both Ken Zucker and others in the space of gender identity and autism spectrum disorder. It's that youth who are diagnosed, who are on the spectrum of autism spectrum disorder, generally have behaviors that can be correlated or co-aligned with those that have or diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So, for example, a child may exhibit obsessive compulsive behaviors of dressing up as the opposite gender. Those traits are evident of autism spectrum disorder, obsessive compulsive behavior. That behavior is also part of a series of behaviors for youth that can be identified as having gender dysphoria. So understanding whether or not it's autism spectrum disorder or actual gender dysphoria is really, really important, because getting the diagnosis correct means that the child then becomes more aware of the different supports that they will need throughout the process. So if it's a autism spectrum disorder, it's a different it's a different set of not interventions, but a different set of perhaps behavioral types. It's so hard for me to understand. But if your child is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, I hate to say that the remedy, but it's not the remedy. It's the corrective behavior, the way in which the way in which psychologists and therapists work with the child will be different than if the child is diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So very interesting research there about the linkage between autism and gender dysphoria. And we know that rates for gender dysphoria are going up as well, to my knowledge. I believe rates of autism are also going up. If you Google that. In a pair of new reports, one focused on 8-year-olds and another on 4-year-olds, the CDC found 1 out of every 36 children has autism. This is a significant increase from 2021, which was 1 in 44, which is a big jump from 1 in 110 in 2006. Excuse me. So we see that we have higher levels of gender dysphoria diagnoses, and we also have a higher number of autism diagnoses as well. So in a pair of new reports, basically 1 out of every 36 children has autism. Really interesting. Autistic adults and parents, we advise you to relax. There's no epidemic of autism. They face an epidemic of need. Right. Diagnosing it requires substantial training and observational techniques. So really interesting that we see a more and more gender dysphoria diagnoses with autism. It just lets me know that there's more to study in this area. And again, something I'd love to discuss more. Okay, I'm going to pause there, check the chat, see what's going on. Someone throw something in the chat. Let me know you're alive. Let me know this makes sense. Let me know that you're loving what I'm putting out or hating what I'm putting out. It's okay to hate it. So we have LGBTQ, more adults being diagnosed, more adults self-identifying as LGBTQ. Zarias just jumped in the channel, so missed some of the content. Zarias, I think you tuned in on Saturday, so I am actually rehashing a lot of what I discussed Saturday because I didn't hit the record button. Thank you that you're loving the podcast and excited to see me go live. I'm excited to go live as well. Let me know what you think and shoot me a message. Let me throw something in the chat. We are talking about gender dysphoria. So we're seeing that more adults are self-identifying as part of the LGBTQ community. We are seeing higher rates of gender dysphoria or child and adolescent referrals for gender dysphoria. I need to get that correct. And then we're also seeing an extremely high number of autism diagnoses as well. And there's a parallel between some researchers showing between autism and gender dysphoria. Very interesting, very fascinating area to study further and the implications this has for our society. Okay, so part of my discussions with others on this topic has been about the school system. So I was talking to a professor who said that schools today, everything is easily Googleable and everything is easily ChatGPT-able as well. And everything in school now, I remember in school learning math, science, whatever, this professor was saying, everything you've learned is now ChatGPT-able, everything is Googleable, everything is easily you can easily find that information and study it. Like, you can literally Google a syllabus of a grade 9 classroom and learn math, algebra, science, all these things online, or find a tutor to help you. It's much more easier and easily accessible. There's walkthrough videos, etc. Now, I don't know how many students are sitting at their computers at home and watching walkthrough videos of algebraic equations. I know I probably would because I really struggled with math, but I can also understand after 8 hours of school, you're probably not spending 3 or 4 hours in the evening on algebra walkthroughs, unless you're super, super interested in doing it and in figuring it out for yourself. So this professor said because it's easily ChatGPT-able and Googleable now, schools are becoming more a function of socializing kids and becoming that institution which prepares kids to enter the society in which they live in by promoting acceptance of all cultures, ethnicities, races, gender identities, sexual orientations. That's the new role for schools. And it got me thinking, it's that's interesting schools are now becoming a function of, having a child enter, society with more open-mindedness when it comes to people of all different walks of life. Now, in theory, that makes sense. And as I'm thinking this through, I'm curious to know this answer to this question. Does higher education lead to more acceptance of different cultures, ethnicities, and communities as a result? Does a higher education lead to more social acceptance, basically, of others? Only high academic performance increases social acceptance, while both average and low school performance decreased it. Wow, that's interesting. Check this out. Okay, so, you know what I love about Google? You ask a question, it not only goes to the research, then it like highlights the question in the research. Studying effects of academic performance and teacher feedback on students' social acceptance. Yeah, that's exactly it. Okay, so the results. The results indicate that both the academic performance and the valence of teacher feedback influence participants' social acceptance of the student in the video. High academic performance had a positive effect, and low academic performance had a negative effect on social acceptance. Interesting. Positive teacher feedback influenced social acceptance positively, while negative teacher feedback influenced social acceptance negatively. However, this effect was moderated by the focus of teachers' feedback. Now, I don't know if this is... being socially accepted is crucial. Among other social acceptance skills... Okay, I think this is social acceptance of yourself by peers. But really what I'm trying to ask is... Okay, let's see. This is how I research, guys. This is it. This is really interesting. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. Probably should do that. Okay, so it says here, higher education can lead the way to a more tolerant society. I don't know if this is necessarily true, but let's see what they say. Okay, so students are demanding and colleges are responding, not only because they have the answers, but because they are a community of educators. It sounds more like political. According to researchers Liliana Garces and Uma Jayakumar, when colleges take such steps, when they assess climate, are deliberate in constructing environments that break down barriers and promote engagement across difference and acknowledge institutional histories, they are in the best position to reap the benefits of their diversity. I would further maintain that they are in the best position to promote tolerance. Okay, this is really interesting. A report by PEN America points out student protests are amplifying new and important voices, while the unrest on campuses and the fallout it produces can cause serious pain points. These points are part of our evolution as educators. Okay, so again, very interesting. I think that this is a fascinating way for where schools are going. It's this way in which schools can be more the institution where students learn more acceptance of others, basically, in the simplest of terms. And I wonder what this will mean for the acceptance of the LGBTQ community. Okay, so here's the challenge. Here's the crossroads that schools then become. As they educate students about social acceptance and social issues, a lot of these social issues then intersect with parents and their own cultural, ethnic, and religious beliefs and freedoms. And so where does a parent's religious freedoms end and the school's quote-unquote right to educate and make aware a student of social issues begin? So if I am a very conservative religious parent and I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman because that's my religious belief and that's my religious freedom, which is enshrined to me in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada, why does my religious freedom get trumped, potentially, if my child is then exposed to marriage being between not just a man and a woman, but a man and a man, a woman and a woman, and full acceptance of LGBTQ. This is where the issue of marriage becomes a bit tricky for schools to navigate, because they have to also remind themselves that while they are educating students about the discrimination that LGBTQ members face, some parents may say, this is promoting an acceptance of something that goes against my religious freedom. And so this is interesting. Okay, so on this point, right? So schools are becoming the place for kids to become more aware of the social issues that they are facing, that they will enter upon graduation. Okay, so then if we go to SOGI, so here in Canada, in 2 provinces, there's something called SOGI 123. I think it's being used in many other provinces, but SOGI stands for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. And it's this push by educators to incorporate sexual orientation and gender identity in schools through tools and resources for educators. Okay, so what is interesting, if you go to the Alberta site, and I forget where it is, it's like one of these links, let's see. Inclusive environments, teaching, here we go, yeah, okay. So I want to point you to a couple things here. So on the SOGI website, and I should share my screen. So this is SOGI's website. Again, it's a curriculum, sexual orientation, gender identity that supports educators by providing them tools, training, and support for navigating these tough conversations in a school setting. So there's a couple issues here. One, parents may be very concerned that young children, as young as, let's say, 6, 7 years old, are being exposed to sexual orientation, gender identity, even if it's from a perspective of discrimination. And why? It's because the idea of sex, gender identity, etc., for many parents, it's that the kid should not be exposed to that at such a young age. Not similarly, but I can think of many social issues that are really atrocious that I'm okay. Again, I'm not a parent, but I would be okay with a school not sharing with a parent with a child at a certain age. Like, I'd be okay reasonably with a child not learning about the Holocaust, not learning about the Rwandan genocide, not learning about mass murders or murder assaults, things like that at a young age, because it's traumatic. These are traumatic social issues. And, when you're growing, your mind isn't fully developed. So I get that. I totally understand that. Sexual orientation, gender identity 123, though, wants to make these topics more accessible when it comes to sexual orientation, gender identity. Okay, so here's a perfect example. So I interviewed Mahmoud Musa, one of the organizers of the LGBTQ in classrooms movements by parents against LGBTQ in classrooms. And one thing that Mahmoud pointed to was SOGI's website. Here, under teaching resources for Alberta, SOGI uses the picture of a Muslim girl in a hijab, and the color on her hijab is the colors of the pride flag. So, to Mahmoud, he believed that this is a marketing ploy by SOGI to target the Muslim community by showcasing a girl in a hijab, a young girl in a hijab. And to him, it's like, if you go anywhere on the site to the other, like there's a young Asian girl, there's a black woman, but there's no other religious group that is identified in their pictures, in their marketing. Right? So policies, young people, inclusive environments, children, teaching, Muslim girl with a hijab, young Asian girl. There's no self-identification of other religious groups, Jewish groups, Catholic groups, Hindu groups. It's only Muslim, a Muslim girl that's identified. And so to Mahmoud, and interestingly enough, he felt that this was a personal attack almost on the Muslim community. That this was somehow personally responding to the issues at the Muslim community in their acceptance of the LGBTQ community. And I am going to pause there for 1 second and just see if anything is happening. This is where the real issue becomes. It's the acceptance of LGBTQ in the classrooms, but where it intersects with religious freedoms. And Mahmoud's point to me was that if his child is a part of the LGBTQ community, he wants to know so that he can support the child. But one thing that Mahmoud felt is that the school curriculum made him feel like there is this targeting of the Muslim community, perhaps for their conservative, in brackets, conservative beliefs of marriage between one man and one woman. And that's not right to Mahmoud. So, I think that there is this stigma, perhaps, that Soji is placing or perpetuating on the Muslim community. And perhaps Mahmoud is echoing that, but it's something that I'd like to explore further. So that's a very interesting part. I think the other really important piece to this is here in Canada, in some provinces, they are pushing for schools to be the safe space for students to express their gender identity, sexual orientation, while still hiding that from their parents. So if you are questioning at a young age your gender identity, you can go to school and say, my name's not Christopher, my name's something else. I don't go by he, him pronouns. I go by, let's say, she, her, or another set of pronouns. The school will refer to you as your other name and your other pronouns, and they will not inform your parent. So that poses a very interesting debate. One, we know for a fact that anxiety, stress, depression, and suicidal ideation is much higher amongst LGBTQ youth than non-LGBTQ youth. We know that. That's a statistic that's well defined and it's out there. We also know that LGBTQ youth face a lot of anxiety in talking to their parents about this. And it's something that perhaps they struggle with and they don't want to openly discuss. So what the theory is instead, it's that the school then becomes the safe haven for a child to fully express who they are, get the supports they need from facilitators, teachers, counselors, etc., and then navigate those conversations with their family when they're ready. So the issue then becomes, where does a parent's right over their child, because they are their legal guardian, begin, and where does the school's responsibility end? And I think the crafters of this policy are presuming that there is a some form of physical or mental violence that will be enacted on the child if they were to come out to their parents saying that they are LGBTQ. Like, I think that is the theory. So let me find it and just talk so that everyone here can. So this was in New Brunswick, and advocates worry is just the beginning. So in New Brunswick, Policy 713, it was introduced in August 2020. It requires a minimum for safe environment for LGBTQ students. But the progressive conservatives made changes to that policy taking effect July 1st. And what were those changes? Let's see. Oh, here it is. A teacher or school will need to obtain parental consent for any child who wants to change their name at school. A student who refuses parental involvement will be referred to a school psychologist or a social worker to develop a plan to inform the student's parents. So basically, you need parental consent if you want to change your name. And if you refuse parental involvement, you're then going to be referred to a school psychologist or social worker to develop a plan to inform the student's parents. So really interesting that the policy here is basically trying to make sure that the student feels that the student has its support of its parents. But again, it may not fully address the issue of, the fact that it's not safe, for example, at home to talk about what's going on. So it's a big debate that's happening right now. And again, it's at that intersection of exploring and exposing kids to the issues that the LGBTQ community faces, but at the same time, to what extent? And where does a parent's rights end and where does the school rights begin for the protection of the child? At the core, I think, of this policy, though, is the assumption that there is some form of violence that a kid is going to face at home by coming out to their parents. And I don't know that to be the case. I can't imagine that most parents would enact, and I'm thinking most parents in Toronto, most cities across North America, that most parents would enact some form of violence towards their children if they were to come out as LGBTQ. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Of course it happens. But I think that that might be a bit overstated because we don't know enough yet. We don't know, to my knowledge, I don't believe there's enough research that indicates that children face physical levels of violence to their parents once they come out. I think instead, children face high levels of anxiety, stress, depression, maybe even suicide, social isolation, feelings of being othered by their family. But physical violence, though, I don't know. And I'd like to explore that further. Again, I'm sure it happens. But to what extent and to how broad and widespread that is, I don't know. And so if a child is going to feel isolated, if a child's family is going to isolate them based on their gender identity, I feel like it doesn't matter if they're 6 or 16, 26, 36, like that's going to happen. I think it's about making sure that parents have the tools to navigate those conversations. So you can see after 53 minutes that I've covered everything and why this is so fascinating to me. As I mentioned from the outset, 7% of US American adults are now identifying as LGBT, which is an uptick dramatically from 2012. We know that members of the LGBTQ community face higher levels of anxiety, stress, depression. There's also a higher level of gender dysphoria rates. There's also a really higher level of autism spectrum disorder rates. There is emerging research showing a linkage between autism and gender dysphoria diagnoses, and that's fascinating because we need to get the diagnoses correct. I hate to say diagnoses. We need to make sure that we get that psychologists understand what the child has so that proper action can be taken, whatever that action is. And we also know that schools are moving away from this place where you're teaching kids a lot of things and more towards propelling that student into becoming more socially, tolerant of different ethnicities, communities, races, classes, and people of sexual orientation and gender identity. As schools embark down this path, they are relying on resources and institutions like SOGI, Sexual Orientation Gender Identity, who may include marketing material targeting specific groups like the Muslim community, which may ostracize members of the community. And finally, there's a push for schools to hide gender identity, sexual orientation, name, pronouns, etc., that students use inside the school from their parents for fear of some type of violence, in my opinion. The violence piece is my stretch, is my opinion. And I'd like to know more about what that means, that is in particular. And we need more research to show that if a child is LGBTQ, they face higher levels of physical violence at home. Because I think in this case, the school is acting as a protector of sorts, but it's not clear that that child faces physical violence. And eventually that child will have to come out to their parents, and they will have to cross that bridge. And perhaps schools are in a better place to help that child navigate those conversations, the child and the parent. But that's a subject for another day. I hope you liked this stream. This is basically what the Open Minds podcast is going to be about, what the streams are going to be about. It's a whole new format for content, and is walking you through what I think is what's missing on the internet, which is this open exploration of these big topics from different perspectives. That's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I finally hit record, so I hope this stays on my profile on Twitch. Let me know what you think. Leave something in the comments. Tell me what I could do better. Was the pace good? Was it long enough, etc.? I'm excited to hear your feedback, so let me know, and I'll definitely catch you in the next one.